Recorded live from Hong Kong and Toronto. Let's go! This is the PR and Law Podcast.
The PR and Law Podcast.
Turn it up. With your hosts, Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie.
Welcome to episode 54 of the PR and Law Podcast. I'm your host, Cam McMurchie, along with Ewan Christie.
Hello, Cameron.
Ewan's an employment lawyer and partner at Duntroon LLP in Toronto, Canada, and online at duntroon.law. I'm a PR guy based in Hong Kong and publisher of the Digital Bits PR and communications newsletter at digitalbitspr.com. If you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, everywhere, basically, and our newsletter, too, at PRLawPodcast.Club. Make sure to sign up for that. Ewan, we got lots to talk about today, but what's happening? How are things going back there? Is COVID still causing problems, and what else is happening in Toronto?
Yeah. The short answer is yeah, Cam. Yeah, we're about, I've kind of become obsessed with the COVID tracker. There's a government. Yeah, it's one of these sort of government websites where it has the vaccination tracker, and I'm refreshing it like 2 or 3 times a day to see where we're at. So we've got 33.405%, Cam, of the Canadian population has received at least one dose.
That's not bad. That's
not great.
Fast. Well, it's not great, but not bad for one dose.
Yeah, it's just, it's somewhat disheartening when you look at our friends to the south, and, they're at 44% that have had at least one dose, and fully vaccinated at 31%. So basically, we're at the same place with one as they are with both shots. So it's I'm trying again. It's one of those things you try to just not think about it and get on with your life as best you can. But
I think people are angry because, there is at the same time, there's so much good news about the vaccine and people getting vaccinated. We're also amid the worst outbreak ever on record for COVID. India is just reeling at this point. It's basically a humanitarian disaster there. And we're seeing these sort of other strains of COVID spread. It's almost, on the one hand, it's very optimistic, but also kind of the worst of it is happening right now too. It's a real juxtaposition.
Yeah, absolutely. So how are you doing?
Well, not bad here. I'm going in for my second shot a week from today. So, we will record next week's show just prior to me going in to get that. So I can't wait to finish that off. But you know what? You know what's coming up this week, Ewan? It's a pastime in Hong Kong. If people have never been here, they won't know about it. But we do these so-called junk trips, a junk being a kind of a classic Chinese kind of boat, which don't really exist anymore, but we still call them junk trips. And it's time to head out and go swimming in the South China Sea, have some drinks, have some food on a boat all day long, get some sunshine, do some wakeboarding. It's that season here. And the first trip of the season is next Friday. So I can't wait.
Oh, that sounds awesome. I want to do that, but I can't get on a plane, man. I just can't get on a plane.
I think we're getting much closer to the day that you can do exactly that.
Continue the debate with us on social media. Join us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at PR Law Podcast. All one word, PRLAW Podcast. Send us your questions now by email to askus@PRLawPodcast.com. That's all one word, askus@PRLawPodcast.com. Or on social media with the hashtag PRLawPod. That's hashtag PRLAWPOD.
We've got tons of stuff to talk about this week. I think, Basecamp was a big story in both, for employment law and for PR last week, because there was a bit of an issue with that company. We're going to talk about that shortly. But before we do, there's another issue that's come up, Ewan, that you're going to talk about that I think really applies to probably everybody listening to this podcast.
Yes, Cam. Yes. The Zoom call.
Yep.
The camera.
Yeah.
Do you turn it on or do you turn it off? What's your take?
So I usually leave it off because to me, if you're going to turn on the Zoom camera, it does mean you have to kind of get up. It means I got to shower and shave and put on a decent shirt and look presentable. Whereas if it's off, I can kind of roll out of bed and just do a work call. And so, yeah, it's for my own vanity probably, but I don't really feel like it's necessary, at least on the calls that I do. It's mostly just issues based and catching up and comparing notes and seeing where we are on some certain projects or something. So I don't like turning the camera on. I feel like it's kind of unnecessary and adds a layer of either complexity or vanity or whatever to the process that just doesn't need to be there. So mark me down as camera off guy.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm absolutely firmly 100% in the camera off camp as well, for all of the reasons that you mentioned. But, this is a really divisive issue, and it's a really sensitive issue for employers as well, because what do you do? If you're trying to have a call with a number of your staff, and, particularly if it's sort of a call early in the week and you're trying to rally the troops, so to speak, in terms of getting them motivated over the course of the week, that can be a really difficult thing to do as an employer when you're just staring into the abyss, right? Mm-hmm. I think we've all sort of been there on our calls where, I know we've talked off air, Cam, about some presentations you've done. I know I've certainly done a few where I just see these empty boxes and nobody's giving me anything back. I don't even know if they can hear me. If there were audio issues, I probably wouldn't know because nobody's letting me know. I can't gauge reaction. Mm-hmm. I have no idea if I'm floundering, if I should stop talking, if I should keep going. All of these things go out the window. And it's a really, really frustrating experience. And it's a really difficult one for employers. And a lot of them are kind of left scratching their heads saying, well, what do we do? What can we do? What are our options? Right?
Yeah. And I mean, to that point, I did attend a class a couple of weeks ago at Hong Kong University via Zoom. And the instructor said right at the very beginning, can people please turn their cameras on? Because, this is an adult class. I'd like to see you guys and it's better for interaction. And can you please turn it on? And I had my camera off at the time and I thought, oh, this is such a pain, but now he's asking for it. And so now I feel like there's pressure to go do it. And I did, I came into the home office and I turned on the camera and I got everything set up and I was doing that. And then I realized there was only 7 of us who had done that out of about 30. And I thought, despite his calls to do this, most people completely ignored him. And I thought about it at that time. I thought, can he make you do this? Maybe not as an instructor, but like, can your boss make you do this? Can your company make you turn this camera on? And it's a good question.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is like so many things we've talked about. These are the sorts of issues that employers are dealing with on the fly, and employees as well, right? Who, we don't really have an established culture around this sort of thing. But what's kind of interesting about it is we're trying to sort of extrapolate and incorporate typical cultural notions of conversation and discourse, ideas like, eye contact. It's important to look people in the eye when you're communicating with them, which again is a very culturally specific notion right from the outset, right? And, from that, almost as an extension of that, goes this idea that, well, then we should keep the cameras on because that's something equivalent to the idea of the eye contact. It's almost an extension of it. And perhaps that's some way of maintaining some level of humanity in these sort of bizarre circumstances we find ourselves in. But really, I think the point here, Cam, it's communication. It's all about communication. And again, the fact that a lot of employers are learning this on the fly makes it tricky. But, if you really want to ensure that your employees are keeping their cameras on, you need to communicate that. And you need to communicate it in a sort of inoffensive way where you're not singling out individual employees. So, some things you can do there, incorporate it as a point of workplace policy and procedural manuals, and then advise the employees by email regarding those changes, right? I think that's really, really important and a good starting point. Mm-hmm. And then you can sort of have a senior HR rep or a manager send employee emails kind of informing them. at that point that the expectation during Zoom calls is that the cameras remain on. And, and this is where you can sort of get into those areas of HR speak that's vetted by people like you, Cam, or, something where really the focus, and you've got to keep it positive, right? This is all about trying to facilitate effective communication during the calls, right?
And team building, that sort of thing. You want to be able to converse and see your colleagues.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if it's communicated that way, look, are our employees going to like it? No, of course. They're not going to like the idea of having to keep a camera on. But I think if at least it's framed in that way, it's a good starting point. And, then from there, if things remain problematic for certain employees, then at that point you can kind of follow up with, again, a general email addressed to everybody saying, hey, just a reminder, this is a new point of policy. And, if it continues to be an issue with individual employees, then, you can kind of contact them specifically and say, are there any issues that we can help you with in terms of the camera thing? Because there needs to be some particular accommodation in this regard, right? We're not all in the same situation. We don't all have the luxury, for example, of having space in our home where we have privacy for a call. And I think these are really, really important considerations to keep in mind when you're trying to incorporate some sort of broad catch-all policy. It's not necessarily going to be able to catch all, given the particular circumstances of the employees at your shop, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, announcing kind of a policy or putting out the expectation and being clear about the fact, that employers want the cameras on, obviously is a really good first step. And I do think that if a lot of employees follow that, there is kind of a peer pressure side to it. You don't want to be the only person not having your camera on either. I mean, you'll turn it on pretty quickly if everyone else has their camera on. So I think that's part of it. But on the space issue, Ewan, I guess, I understand if employers ask for this, or if at the start of the meeting, whoever's chairing the meeting asks for this. Is it something they can demand? And I guess it is, because they're your employer, right? I mean, this goes to everything that we talk about on this show. They can ask you to do all kinds of things, within a reason, of which I would say the camera being on is within reason, especially if you normally were working in the office and now you're working from home. It seems like a reasonable expectation to turn the camera on. But is this the kind of thing that really can be enforced, or does the employee have some grounds here to say, like, look, I don't have much space, or I don't have much privacy here, or I don't feel comfortable with the camera on, and I don't want to do that. Is there any dispensation kind of under the law for that kind of thing? I mean, yeah,
employers have certain duties and obligations with regard to accommodation, right? And again, most of those typically go back to things that we see that are protected grounds under the Human Rights Code. So anything that might fall under a protected ground of discrimination around, race, age, disability, sexual orientation, these sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, there is an obligation on employers to accommodate those employees that require accommodation. Where this is sort of a unique situation, Cam, is some of those more peripheral issues, the gray areas, right? So let's take sort of a hypothetical, and it's a very real hypothetical. Let's say, you're a father, you're working at home, and you're taking care of 2 or 3 young children, and you've got a dog, and you live in a 500 square foot apartment, because these are very real situations that people are dealing with. Should that father in that situation be obliged to keep his camera on? I think under that specific circumstance, could an employer say, you got to do it? Sure. I mean, I guess they could, but is that really in the best interest of the kind of culture you'd want to try and nourish and develop and nurture at your company? And I would say probably not. So yeah, there are always going to be these situations that you're going to have to deal with on a case-by-case basis, even if you do want to create sort of a broader policy that says, look, we understand people are dealing with difficult situations, and that this is by no stretch of the imagination quote unquote normal. That being said, where possible, we would like people to be respectful of those of their fellow colleagues during work calls and try and keep their cameras on, because you know what? It does help facilitate effective communication. We know that most of our cues for the brain are visual ones. So let's try and make that a little bit easier for employees, as opposed to just staring into this, black abyss on a group call, right?
Yeah, this is one of those things I'd love to hear from our listeners too, because I'm sure this has come up for almost everybody at some point, especially a year into this pandemic now, and with working from home so common and Zoom, basically becoming the term that means video chat or video conference. I'd love to hear what other companies have done or what other people have done to sort of manage this situation. So yeah, if anyone wants to share that with us, just tag us PRLawPod on Twitter, and we can come back to it on the next show.
Just quickly, Cam, the only other issue is, of course, socioeconomic, right? That we're also making assumptions, we even in the hypothetical we talked about, we're making assumptions that people have the internet capabilities,
right,
and the hardware and the computer software to be able to even engage in remote work over Zoom, to participate in these calls. And the reality is that in a lot of circumstances, that's simply not the case. And that again goes to situations where employers need to be cognizant of these issues, and they need to accommodate where accommodations required.
That just occurred to me, actually, Ewan, when you brought this up. Some businesses will give you a laptop or a phone, right? But I don't think that's the majority still. I think most people still, just regular working class people go into the office and log in or whatever and do their work. I bet employers have saved so much money on cost of equipment, because I think a lot of people who are working from home, as you say, are probably relying on either their home computer or their home laptop or their home webcam, their home internet connection, which they're paying for themselves. Yeah, that I don't know why I hadn't considered that before, but that seems like kind of a big deal too, a big win for employers.
Well, yeah. And I mean, and the government has sort of helped address this issue in trying to provide, new tax write-offs for families. But again, this is sort of drop in the bucket stuff. And I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent here, Cam, but even outside of the employer-employee relationship, this is also a very real issue for remote education, right? Families where you've got 3 and 4 kids in a small home, and everybody is trying to homeschool over Zoom because schools are closed and everybody's dealing with that remotely. Again, infrastructure, do you have the luxury of having enough devices for all of the children at the home to engage and log on to school? Do you have the bandwidth for your internet? I mean, all of this stuff, these are very, very real issues, Cam, that people are struggling with. That, again, a lot of people just turn a blind eye. They just assume, hey, I've got great high-speed internet, and they don't even think about these issues. But this is very real stuff that people are dealing with every single day, for as long as this, craziness around this pandemic continues.
Show your support to the PR and Law podcast by making a one-time donation or setting up a subscription with us on Patreon. Every little bit helps us keep the lights on and bring the show to you each week. If you'd like to chip in, please visit PRLawPodcast.com. That's PRLawPodcast.com. Click support the show. Thanks for helping us out.
One of the more fascinating issues this week, Ewan, was what happened at Basecamp. And I know that you had flagged this as well as something to talk about kind of from an employment law point of view. And yeah, I think I did a ton of reading on this. I guess you did too, hey, because it was pretty interesting.
I sure did. And then, of course, in real time, was watching, the slew of resignations over Twitter. I mean, yeah. I can't think, I'm sure something like that's happened before. I've never actually experienced it, Cam. But anyway, I'll let you give the backstory before we get there.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. So, I mean, for those who aren't aware, Basecamp is it's basically productivity software, but it's a SaaS business, software as a service, and basically they provide an internet-based productivity suite where you can track projects and chat with colleagues and that kind of thing. But it's meant for small business or medium-sized businesses, and they've done very well. Just last year, they announced a new email product called Hey, which is one that I have been using and quite enjoying, the kind of rethought email. So it's a forward-thinking company, or I thought it was a forward-thinking company. And the two founders are both quite charismatic, and they're both quite public in what they do. So David Heinemeier Hansen is one of the founders, and Jason Fried is the other. And they've taken very high-profile stances on issues, and they're often out in the media, and they're often blogging on issues on the company website. So it's a very active company, I would say, sort of in those kinds of issues. Anyway, it's also a small company. There's only 57, or rather there were 57 or 58 people working there, counting those two founders. So it's not exactly a large, Fortune 500 company or anything like that. But last week, Ewan, the founders of this company decided to create a new policy at work, which is no more discussion of political or societal issues on workplace communication channels. And to be clear, the workplace communication channel they're referring to is their own, which is Basecamp. That is how they communicate with each other. And the founders no longer want the sort of political or societal issues to be discussed in those channels. Those were not the only changes, though. There were actually a few things that were explained in one of the blog posts in addition to that, which is no more paternalistic benefits, quote unquote. They no longer want to offer a wellness allowance, a farmer's market share, no more continuing education allowances. And they phrased it this way, quote, "They felt good at the time, but we've had a change of heart. It's none of our business what you do outside of work, and it's not Basecamp's place to encourage certain behaviors, regardless of good intention. By providing funds for certain things, we're getting too deep into nudging people's personal, individual choices. So we've ended these benefits, and they will pay each employee the full cash value of the benefits for this year, and they launched a profit-sharing plan in its place. No more committees. They've canceled all the committees. Among them was the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, which had just formed in February. That is to be disbanded. No more lingering or dwelling on past decisions. And then number 5, Ewan, this relates to HR in a big way, no more 360 reviews. I think, again, people on this podcast probably know what that is, but basically it's when you're doing a performance review or appraisal and you're getting feedback from people below you, your peers, those above you, to get a complete look at sort of how your performance has gone. So these are, I think each of these is probably worth a discussion, but today, the main focus here really is on the issue over these political and societal discussions. Is this how you see it, Ewan?
Yeah, this is just a mess from so many different angles, Cam. I really want to tip my hat to Casey Newton, who's a writer. He did a long form piece on Platformer on this. We'll put it in the show notes. I highly encourage people to check it out. It really digs into the story. He interviewed a number of the employees. Really, really fantastic piece. And I learned that, this whole sort of debacle actually goes back over a decade and sort of started with a number of customer service reps who were keeping a list of customer names that they found funny, titled best names ever. And the way that Casey Newton sort of describes this, nobody would really give specific examples other than to say it was sort of Simpson-esque, where Bart calls Mo at the bar and asks to speak with Seymour Butts. That kind of stuff. And fast forward over a decade, and a number of employees who were familiar with this list, they were really, really uncomfortable about it, and they started talking about it on the the internal chat forums, and they were arguing that there should be some accountability on the company's part, and the company needs to do more to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion at the company. And that, as I understand, Cam, or at least as Casey Newton talks about, that was what prompted the comments from the two executives. And again, they're really interesting. I was very curious to get your take on just the writing style, where very clearly, particularly in Fried's post, where he comes right out and he says, this comes from This comes from me, and this comes from David. They're very, very clear. The way it's written, it doesn't read like PR communications speak at all. It's very, very direct. But I think for the purposes of our listeners, and just to give context, I think that the quote, Cam, from Freed's post is sort of interesting. I'd like to read it. It's just a few sentences. So this is the one on, the bullet point number 1, right? No more societal and political discussions in our company Basecamp account. This is what he actually said about that. Quote, today's social and political waters are especially choppy. Sensitivities are at 11, and every discussion remotely related to politics, advocacy, or society at large quickly spins away from pleasant. You shouldn't have to wonder if staying out of it means you're complicit or wading into it means you're a target. These are difficult enough waters to navigate in life, but significantly more so at work. It's become too much. It's a major distraction. It saps our energy and redirects our dialogue toward dark places. It's not healthy. It hasn't served us well. And we're done with it on our company Basecamp account where the work happens. People can take the conversations with willing coworkers to Signal, WhatsApp, or even a personal Basecamp account, but it can't happen where the work happens anymore. End quote. What do you think? What do you think, Cam? Because I read that and I was just chomping at the bit to get your take on it.
Well, so I'm familiar with Jason Fried to begin with. I watched a long video that he recorded last year about email, and he's a very outspoken, opinionated guy. And actually, I appreciate his forthrightness in his writing. I think my issue there is almost right at the halfway point is where I kind of fall off, because I agree with him on the first part of that, which is these are difficult times. These are difficult issues. People feel strongly about them. It's making things complicated. I don't think there would be much disagreement on that. But then in the second half, he draws his own conclusions about what to do about that. And that's where I kind of fall off the bus, because they're conclusions that I don't think are universally drawn from those issues. I think they're ones that he has drawn from those issues. And I want to get into actually the communication side of it, Ewan, because I think that part is absolutely fascinating. But I will say this issue came up on the Pivot podcast. You and I have talked about the Pivot podcast before. It's got Kara Swisher from the New York Times and Fox, and Scott Galloway, the NYU marketing professor, who's got quite a following these days. And they dealt with this issue just the other day, in fact. And I'm going to cue up Scott Galloway first, because I thought his take was quite interesting, and I guess I was a little bit surprised, but here's what he had to say.
I do think there's people out there that don't live and breathe politics and want to go to work and create economic security for them and their families and have good relationships with their colleagues, and not find out that the guy or gal next to him is a Trumper or really far left, and bring that bullshit to work. I do think that there's a lot of people that say, I get it. But if a few companies decide that, you know what, we are a fantastic legal entity where we bring human resources together and intellectual property to help all of us create economic security for us and our families so that we can put food on the table. And then on evenings and weekends, if you want to go to a Bernie or a QAnon rally, that's your business. Right. But we're not going to be in that business.
What do you think, Ewan?
Look, that's one take on it. I don't think Galloway is wrong. And look, if an employer wants to take a position and say, look, we're not going to provide a forum or a platform for employees to discuss these particular issues, cool, fine, you can do it. There's nothing that prevents you or precludes you from doing that. But understand that in this climate, particularly in an industry where the majority of your employees are likely under the age of 50 or 45, they're going to take issue with that. And that's fine if that's the particular culture you want to nurture and develop at your company. But understand there are going to be repercussions to that. And whether you want to refer to the individuals who are going to come at you as, the woke mob or the social justice warriors or whatever sort of, negative connotations that, certain individuals may wish to apply to them, it doesn't change the fact that it's going to have very significant and severe repercussions to your business. So, if you want to have open forum and open discourse around these issues at your company, cool. Then that becomes part of your brand. And this company has clearly chosen, no, we don't want any part of that, and consequences be damned. And frankly, well, we're seeing what the consequences are, Cam. There's the fallout has been swift and severe, unlike anything I've seen in recent memory, actually. This is it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I think that's why this issue is so fascinating to me, is actually there are a lot of different layers to this, and there's a lot of different angles and a lot of background to consider. Because I think, one part of this is the idea of bringing, your whole self to work. And, I guess I'm a person that doesn't do that, but I know a lot of people do that. And I feel like there is I think especially in the United States in 2021, I think people do consider bringing their whole selves into work as something that is normal and appropriate. And so I think there is an adjustment here to kind of, I don't want to say a new generation, but there's kind of a new way of thinking about this. And that's an issue sort of wrapped up in this too. Now, Kara Swisher basically argued that what's happened here was inevitable because, staff have been encouraged to speak up on a wide range of issues for quite a while now, including at Basecamp. I mean, you mentioned that they've made a decision not to discuss these issues. They have as of last week. But prior to that, they had been one of the companies that were promoting people to talk about this the most. And so she said, that the managers and the founders of these companies kind of bear a little bit of responsibility here. Here's what she had to say.
They've raised a generation of people saying, talk all you want. And when you don't, when they decided it got a little too tiresome for them, when it made them slightly uncomfortable and they were starting to discover things about hiring and salaries and stuff like that, they wanted them to shut up.
Which is kind of what has happened, I think. Now, you and I want to get right to the PR issue because there's obviously some background there that we've gone through. And we always say, like, what is a PR person's job? Like, what is the comms person supposed to do? And, I think at the root, it really is to protect the brand reputation and promote the brand as well. But mainly, number one, you want to make sure that that your brand has the reputation that you think it should have. That the ownership has, that is commensurate with the objectives and the business and the priorities and all of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you will avoid negative press at all cost. I think this confuses people sometimes. I think maybe it's a little bit the same in law, Ewan, where you can come up to a client or, in this case, executives and say, if you do this, there's going to be backlash against your company. That, like you said, that's just the fact, right? Like they can go ahead and do this, but there's going to be fallout. And then the executives of Basecamp don't need to take that advice. I mean, they have to decide what they want to do, right? And I think in this case, they did expect blowback. I don't know if they've expected as much as they've received, but they did decide to go ahead and make this policy change. As you said, Ewan, a lot of people have resigned. At last count, I saw 20 of 57 or 58 people. About a third of the staff have resigned already. On the positive side, I do commend Jason and David for having the courage of their convictions. I think doing something like this is difficult, and I do think they had their eyes open, and I do think this is what they genuinely believe. And I think far too infrequently do founders or company leaders, lead, with the courage of their convictions. So I certainly applaud that. And there's no vindictiveness here either about the leaving colleagues. So, after this all broke, they posted another item to the website, which said this, quote, "Yesterday, we offered everyone at Basecamp an option of a severance package worth up to 6 months' salary for those who've been with the company over 3 years and 3 months' salary for those at the company less than that. No hard feelings, no questions asked. For those who cannot see a future at Basecamp under this new direction, we'll help them in every which way we can to land somewhere else." So that tells me that they decided to go down this path. They knew there was going to be blowback. They would try and take the high road and just go do it. And they are. Now, the fallout. I think, Ewan, the question here at the root of all of this is it okay to shut down political discussion at work? Or is shutting down uncomfortable discussions a privilege because the very issues being raised are about diversity and inclusion? Jason and David, as two white males, may not be impacted by these issues directly. Thus, their decision to shut it down so quickly. So if employees are facing discrimination or inequality at work, shutting down the discussion only serves to reinforce that status quo, whatever that might mean for that individual. And I think that's the crux of the problem here and why some people felt so strongly about the decision that they made.
Yes, absolutely. And this is actually a specific issue that Casey Newton addresses in his long form post. I mean, one of the individuals that he interviews is a data analyst named Jane Yang. And she said to Newton that she was concerned that restricting internal conversations would negatively affect diversity and inclusion efforts at the company. And she gave an example. She said, the company's profit sharing plan gave more profits to people who have longer tenure, a group that is majority white and male, and that making discussions off limit internally could ensure that inequality in profit sharing becomes a structural feature of the company. I think these are very real issues. I think also something that seems to have fallen by the wayside was that this whole kerfuffle again emerged around this best names ever list. And both Fried and Hennemeyer Hansen have acknowledged that they have known for years about the existence of this list and didn't do anything about it. And I think it's somewhat telling that both of their letters, because Hennemeyer Hansen also issued a statement not long after Fried's, where, again, and the tone and message is very much consistent with what Fried had to say around political discourse and discussions. But neither one of their statements makes any reference or any mention to this list, which was, again, sort of the boiling point that led to all of these issues in the first place. And I think that that's quite telling.
I guess I read it a little bit differently. The list clearly was what maybe drew attention to this in the first place. But over the last year, there's a long list of issues that people have complained about related to diversity and inclusion. So the list may have been a catalyst, but I didn't see that as a key point really in this beyond that, because there were a lot of other things that the staff had concerns about as well. But listen, there is something to really make clear here, and I think people kind of confuse this sometimes, which is I want to talk about this from a PR perspective, right? Rather than what is the right thing to do, or what is the morality around the issue. I think from a PR angle, that can kind of be a rocky road to go down there. If I'm at Basecamp and the two founders came to me and said, "Look, these discussions on these issues are going out of control, and it's impacting productivity in the company, and it's a distraction." My advice would not have been to just shut everything down. I mean, that seems almost like a defensive or scared kind of response. And I know they've couched it as something to refocus the company. I think they could have refocused the company. Indeed, I think there's ways around allowing these discussions in certain ways and just making sure that the work is also getting done. I think there's a very easy middle ground here that I'm sure could have been found. So from a PR perspective, that would have been my advice in that situation. However, the fact that they went forward with it, I don't necessarily disagree with either, just because they have, I mean, this is what they believe, right? It's very difficult for me to say they should have done something else. Ultimately, from a PR perspective, they should have done something else. But I would also say that founders and leaders of companies should direct the company in the way that they want to, and they have that right to do so. And there is that side of it that I do kind of respect. And I think, I've talked about the exchange, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, where I worked before you and a few times on this show, and the fact that our chief executive, and I remember sitting in meetings with him, and we would bring up issues where we would say, if you say this or if you do this, we are going to get blowback in the market. We're going to get blowback in the press. And he would say, that's fine, because this is the right thing to do and we can take it. And I do admire that approach. I actually think more businesses should probably look at things that way, which is, who are you? What do you stand for? What do you want to be? What do you want to be known as? What are the values of this company? And then go forward with it, provided they're not super extreme, obviously. So there's that side to it too. But I think it's going to be really interesting, Ewan, what happens from here, because a third of their staff have resigned already. And this is not a big company, as I said. I mean, it's not like they've got, all the money in the world, though they are doing well. And I think the fallout from this will be seen for a while.
Yeah, I think the thing that I really struggle with here, Cam, is that we're talking about a company that has not been shy about taking political positions in the past, right? And then encouraging their employees to sort of openly discuss those political issues. And I think that optically, at least from a PR perspective, would be something that I would be genuinely concerned about. That if status quo is that, yes, we take political positions on controversial issues and we discuss them openly, and then when an issue comes up that as executives we don't necessarily agree with, or we disagree with the pushback that we're getting from employees in terms of, pressure to advance more diversity, equity, and inclusion at the company, we all of a sudden just shut it down. Because the message you can very, readily take from that is, we're cool about talking about political issues as long as they're political issues that we believe in as executives. And I think that's problematic.
Although, it looks like they've shut that down too, though. I don't think any political issues are to be discussed under this policy, as far as I read it. No. And you're absolutely right. What I'm saying is that policy wasn't introduced until someone asserted a position or an argument, or a group of employees asserted a particular political position or argument that clearly the employers took issue with on some level. If they didn't take issue with it, there wouldn't have been a need to shut it all down in its entirety anyway, right? And even if that wasn't the case, optically, it's very, very easy to draw that conclusion. And I think that's part of why they found themselves in such a difficult position. Yeah, I think it's hard to say. This isn't, the issues brought up this year are not the first time issues have been brought up inside Basecamp on diversity and inclusion. So I don't feel like someone had an opinion contrary to the founders and they shut it down. That's what happened at the macro level, but I think on the micro level, there have been discussions for a while. So it didn't happen immediately or suddenly as soon as somebody had a position that way. But I do think that there is, and I've seen this in the coverage, and you kind of touched on it, this sort of confusion between a company taking a political stance and the employees taking one. And I think these are two entirely different things to me. They're related, I suppose, in a way. But I think it's quite common, actually, for companies to say this is something that we stand for as a company, but that employees might go off and do something different. Actually, I think that's very common. In fact, if you look at a company like Apple, for instance, they're really big on diversity inclusion as well. But individuals are free to go do or get involved with what they would like, provided it doesn't draw negative attention to the company. So those are sort of separate issues. But regardless, Ewan, do you think this is something that more employers are going to consider? I know that the situation in Canada is not as charged as the situation in the United States, but do you see this becoming a trend? Because Coinbase actually was the first company that we're aware of that did this last year. So Basecamp is kind of the second. So two have gone down this path, but do you think others will too?
Yeah, I think they will. I don't think this issue is going away, and I think it's probably going to continue to sort of develop and boil over with other companies, such that they're going to have to take a position and address it. And one thing I liked that you said, Cam, is regardless of what you whether you support or oppose the position that Basecamp has taken, at least they've taken a position. And I do sort of agree with you in that regard. We've talked a lot about on this show, particularly around the Black Lives Matter movement, where there's been no shortage of corporations that have stepped up and made these sort of lukewarm lip service, toe the party line, walk right down the middle on the issue. And I don't really think that there's any value in doing that either. And you know what? The individuals who are pushing for more, greater diversity in corporate environments, more equity, more inclusion, they can smell it, right? They know that is just a line and that it's paying lip service to a cause. I don't really think that does companies any good service either. So if you're going to take a position, at least dig in, own that position, and have it reflected in your policies and procedures as a company. Have it reflected in your hiring practices, regardless of what it is. Make sure it's a top-down structure that you can see at every level of the company, because at least that way, when you're looking at that company as a prospective employee, you can understand and recognize it for what it is, and then make a clear and informed choice as to whether or not that's the kind of environment you want to work in.
Wait a minute. Check this out.
Whoa, hey, check this out.
No, wait. Oh, check it out.
I want you to check this out.
On the PR and Law Podcast.
What do you got, dog?
I've got Harper's article, Cam, the cover story of the most recent edition of Harper's Magazine is an article called Sign of the Times, Caliphate and the Perils of Reporting Online.
Oh.
This is a long form article by James Harking. It's an incredible piece, Cam. Again, we talk about this on the show every now and then, just the value of real exceptional quality long form journalism. This is one of those pieces that is up there. It talks about obviously the now debunked New York Times podcast Caliphate by Rukmini Callimachi, and just how that whole debacle went down. And Harkin speaks with everybody that you would want to speak with in covering the story. He digs and digs and digs. And it's a real eye-opener, Cam, in what happens when you have sort of this upper echelon of rock star journalists, and how, some of the typical rules and procedures of journalism don't really apply to them, and how that is a problem, and how, Caliphate is sort of it's a real cautionary tale in what journalists need to watch out for in doing their work.
Yeah, I am aware of that situation. I have been following it. I will absolutely check this out too, because everything you just said is bang on. I'm going to share one that your wife retweeted, Ewan, when I pushed it out on Twitter. And it is a story about the vaccines, and it's called the hot person vaccine. The internet has decided that Pfizer is significantly cooler than Moderna. But why? And this was in the Atlantic. It is interesting. I mean, I'm outside of the sort of cultural sphere of the U.S., being over here in Asia, so I don't see as much of this, but I did kind of pick up on this a bit. And sort of the article kind of talks about the Pfizer superiority complex. And there was one quote in here that says, quote, "One of my cousins got Moderna," and I was like, that's okay. We need a strong middle class. And I thought, this is about bang on. And is there kind of it's tongue in cheek, clearly, but at the same time, there's kind of a little thread of actual maybe elitism or coolness or class strata or class structure underneath some of this. But it's a funny article. I mean, like, one of the things is Pfizer's considered higher class because it sounds expensive. Many high-end fashion brands are named after people like Pfizer is. Fendi, Prada, Kenzo. Many are two syllables. The F and the Z sounds also kind of make something sound fast and and high end. So all of these kinds of things. It is a funny article. It's worth a read. Anything about the pandemic that's kind of funny, I think, is needed in these moments.
That's great. Well, and we talked about this last week, Cam, here in Canada, the AstraZeneca drug vaccine that was just open to all the Gen Xers, largely because the boomers were saying, oh, well, but it's got a lower efficacy rate and there's blood clot issues. And as a result, they basically opened up the AstraZeneca drug to individuals 40 and over, and Gen X stepped up and they're like, bring it. We will take it, boomers. Get out of the way. We're all in. We don't care. We've been raised on Pop-Tarts and Young and the Restless and played in treacherous playgrounds and leaded gasoline and leaded paint. You name it. We'll take that sweet, sweet AstraZeneca drug any day.
Yeah. That one, AstraZeneca is a legit one. This is really looking at Moderna and Pfizer, mainly because they're the mRNA drugs. But it does also say that if Moderna, like if you're a good and modern drug, you don't call yourself Moderna, which also kind of puts that.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that.
So that comes up in here too. And it basically says Johnson & Johnson is what's being used on homeless people, which is not, well, that is true, but it's also an excellent drug. But anyway, it's worth a read. I'll put a link in the show notes. Ewan, we got to wrap up. Anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. Great show. Great chat.
Good discussion.
Would love to hear the feedback from the listeners.
Absolutely. Thanks again for joining us. Don't miss a show. You can subscribe in your podcast app of choice or to our YouTube or SoundCloud channels. And of course, the socials, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and newsletter at PRLawPodcast.Club. For Ewan, this is Cam. Light it up.
This has been the PR and Law Podcast with Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or leave a review. You can also join us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by following our account at PR Law Podcast. That's all one word, PRLAW Podcast. Thanks for your support.